Hi, I'm Darius, the forgotten one. When my stepfather died, he left $45 million to my siblings. Me? I got a dusty wooden chest nobody even looked twice at. At the funeral, my brother-in-law laughed and said, "The useless one gets the useless box." They thought I'd just walk away quietly, like always. But that night, I opened the chest, and it rang. The phone inside hadn't made a sound in years. And when I answered, the voice said something that didn't just shake me. It changed everything. What if the only inheritance I ever needed wasn't money? What if silence had been my weapon all along? I sat in the corner of the living room where the scent of leather and old cologne clung to the air. The drapes were drawn just enough to mute the late Texas sun, but not enough to block the feeling that something ugly was about to happen. Crystal glasses clinked quietly, ice swirling over bourbon and scotch, while the others kept their eyes on the lawyer standing by the fireplace. They wore black, tailored black. Grief looked expensive on them. The lawyer, a pale, narrow man who used too many syllables, cleared his throat and opened the will. "To my beloved children, Cecilia, Darren, Colton, Elise, and Vanessa, I leave the sum of $9 million each, to be distributed immediately upon the execution of this document." There were gasps, smothered by polite coughs. My sister Elise pressed her hand against her heart like she'd just found God in the rug. The lawyer continued, "To my stepson, Darius Kane." My name cut through the room like a stone in a glass pond. "I leave the contents of my personal effects box, located in storage room B2, as a gesture of remembrance." Silence, not the reverent kind. Colton, my sister Vanessa's husband, turned his head just enough to catch my eye. He let out a dry chuckle. "The useless one gets the useless box," he said. A few smiled behind their glasses. Some didn't bother hiding it. I didn't flinch. But the words, they hit harder than a slap, because they came from a man who didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He raised lawyers and contracts and public notaries. He raised suspicion like a flag. And now he'd raised the curtain on what he thought of me. The room moved on like nothing had happened. Toasts were made, tears wiped delicately. I stayed seated. Then a butler walked in, wheeling a small cart with a chest on top. The thing was ugly, wooden, dull, with tarnished hinges and scratches deep into its sides like claw marks. Dust coated the top like no one had touched it in years. But as they rolled it closer, I noticed one thing no one else did. A faint brand on the side, RJC, my stepfather's initials. It wasn't some random box. It was his, and that made it worse. The lawyer didn't look at me, not once. Not even when I asked with my eyes. Why? No answer. Just a nod toward the chest, then his eyes darted to his watch, like he had somewhere else to be now that the circus was over. I stood. My chair didn't scrape. I didn't speak. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I walked over, rested my hand on the chest's lid. The wood was warm, like it had something inside it, still alive. Colton lifted his glass, smirking. "Maybe there's a sock puppet in there, Darius, or a mirror, so you can talk to the only person who thinks you matter." Elise snorted. Cecilia avoided my eyes. Darren was already on the phone with a banker. I picked up the box. It wasn't light, not because of weight, but because it held something I couldn't name yet. Something that didn't belong in that room. As I turned to leave, Vanessa called out after me, "We all grieve in our own ways, Darius. Just don't make it about you." I said nothing. Outside, the clouds cracked. Rain fell like someone had punched through heaven. I carried the chest to my truck, unlocked the passenger door, and placed it gently on the seat like it was breakable. Before I climbed in, I stood for a moment, letting the rain soak my shirt, roll down my arms, drip from my jaw. Inside the cab, I looked at the box again. It sat still, innocent, like all it ever did was exist. I ran my fingers across the lid. The wood felt rough, unfinished, like something meant to be hidden. I started the engine, but I didn't drive. I sat there, staring through the rain-soaked glass. My own face blurred in the reflection, like I wasn't fully there. Like I was waiting to become someone else. Maybe I would. I didn't drive off right away. The rain tapped steady against the windshield, thick and rhythmic, like a metronome set to a slow ache. The old wipers dragged across the glass with a tired squeal. I adjusted the heat, then rested my hand on the steering wheel, staring at the wooden chest still sitting in the passenger seat. It looked like it didn't belong to anyone, just a leftover from someone who never had much to say. I pulled onto the road, tires slicing through shallow puddles along the edge of the driveway. My stepfather's estate disappeared behind me in the mirror. Good riddance. The roads were mostly empty, just a few headlights in the distance. I kept the radio on low, a country talk show fading into static. But just before I clicked it off, I caught the last smug sentence from some finance guy they were interviewing. The strength of a family legacy is how well it takes care of its own. I let out a quiet laugh, dry as dust. Guess not every legacy is worth holding on to. The dashboard lights blinked softly as I turned down a street I knew by memory. Each curve pulled up some piece of the past, whether I wanted it or not. I passed the old Methodist church where Mom remarried. I was 11, shoes too tight, tie choking my neck, standing next to her on the lawn while he shook the preacher's hand like a man finalizing a merger, not joining a family. He never raised his voice at us, never laid a finger, just gave you that nod, the kind that meant you could leave the room now. He knew how to shut people out without saying a word. That was his real power. Reward the talkers, ignore the workers. Somehow, I always ended up with the hammer and the list of chores. I was never loud enough, I muttered, watching my own reflection flicker in the window. Raindrops streaked across it, blurring the man staring back. I turned into my neighborhood, a quiet patch of cracked sidewalks and faded shutters. The kind of place where people still wave from their porches but don't ask too many questions. My porch light flickered as I pulled into the driveway. The gutter above the door was clogged again, water pouring down like a faucet left on. I cut the engine. The truck gave one last rattle before settling. I reached across and grabbed the chest. The wood was damp now from my coat, the smell of old pine and mildew rising faintly from it. It felt heavier than it should. Again. Inside, the house was dark except for the yellow bulb in the kitchen. The air carried the faint scent of sawdust from the garage. I hadn't been out there in a while, not since the last job fell through. I set the chest down on the kitchen table. It let out a low groan, the hinges creaking like they were protesting being moved at all. I stared at it. Just a box. I didn't open it. Instead, I opened a beer, sat across from it like it might suddenly speak. The condensation on the can mirrored the rain still beating against the windows. I thought about calling someone. But who? Everyone I ever leaned on either turned their back or buried me in expectations I never asked for. The hours slid by. By midnight, I was half asleep on the couch, boots still on, one arm over my face. I'd forgotten the garage radio was still on. It must have picked up a rerun from earlier in the day. Colton's voice crackled faintly through the static. "We're a family of success stories," he was saying. "Each one of us earned our place." His voice cut through me sharper than anything the rain could do. I didn't move, just let the words echo. "Each one of us earned our place," I whispered to no one. Except me. I closed my eyes. But I kept seeing the chest. Even in the dark, it seemed to sit there with purpose. Waiting. Quiet. Just like the man who left it behind. By morning, the rain had stopped. But something inside me hadn't. The world outside my window looked washed clean, but my head still carried the storm. The air was thick with the scent of wet dirt and coffee grounds. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, a chipped mug in my hand, steam fogging my glasses. The wooden chest sat in the middle of the room, unmoved, like it was waiting for me to say something first. I told myself I wouldn't touch it again, not yet. But as I walked past, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. An edge of tape under the lid, yellowed and peeling. I bent down, pulled it loose, and found a small envelope stuck to the underside. No name, no handwriting, just blank. I opened it. Inside was a single photo, glossy, faded at the edges. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. My family, dressed sharp at a charity gala years ago. My stepfather in his tux, his hand on Mom's shoulder. My brothers, my sisters, even Colton, all smiling at the camera like they were born to belong there. But I wasn't in it. I didn't need to think long to remember that night. I was home, waiting by the phone for an invitation that never came. That picture hit me harder than anything they said at the will reading. It wasn't just that they forgot me. It was that they remembered to leave me out. I sank into a chair, the mug warm between my palms, and the sound of rain dripping from the gutter filled the silence. The photo lay on the table like evidence, and then the memory pulled me back. It was a decade ago. I was 28, standing by Mom's grave, holding a small bouquet I couldn't afford. The air was heavy that morning, the kind that made every breath taste like iron. I'd just finished fixing the broken fence at the old house. Then I heard laughter. Tires on gravel, a car slowing as it passed by the cemetery road. Through the windshield, I saw them. My siblings, dressed up, laughing, windows cracked just enough for the smell of perfume and champagne to spill out. Headed to that charity dinner. The one they said was just for business partners. Cecilia saw me. I know she did. Her hand went to her hair like she was embarrassed. Then the car sped up. They didn't even wave. That was the day I learned forgotten isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a choice. I stood there, the flowers trembling in my hand. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was to be hurt by something as small as not being invited. But it wasn't small. It was the message underneath. You don't belong here anymore. I walked back to my truck, tossed the bouquet on the seat, and told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It always did. Years later, I found myself at another one of their events, a family anniversary party. They'd sent the invitation late, said it was an oversight. I showed up anyway, wearing the only decent jacket I owned. The banquet hall glowed with gold light and expensive flowers. A long table stretched across the room with name tags perfectly aligned like soldiers at inspection. And there it was, my name, Darius, sitting at the end of the table, next to a waiter's station stacked with dirty glasses. I stood there for a second, then walked toward it, pretending not to care. A hostess caught my hesitation and smiled nervously. "Oh, sorry about that. They must have moved your place. Let me check." She looked to the center of the room where my siblings were seated, laughing, champagne glasses in hand. She whispered something to Cecilia, who nodded without looking at me. The hostess returned with that polite, fake smile people wear when they've been told to keep the peace. "This way," she said, leading me to a small round table in the corner, near the kitchen door. The tag with my name had been quietly moved there. Every time a waiter came out with trays, the door hit the back of my chair. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared to. When they made a toast to family, I lifted my glass with them, even though no one looked my way. Later that night, as they took a big group photo, the photographer waved and said, "One more space. Squeeze in." But no one moved. The shot snapped without me. Again. The hiss of the coffee pot brought me back to the present. The photo still sat in front of me, curled slightly at the corners. My reflection overlapped with their smiles, distorted by the glossy paper. I whispered to the empty room, "You kept everything that didn't matter and forgot the only thing that did." The chest creaked softly as the air warmed. It almost sounded like it was agreeing with me. For a long time, I just sat there, the weight of it all pressing down. Being forgotten was one thing, but being erased, that was something else. It wasn't about money or names on a will anymore. It was about proof. Proof that I existed in a family that worked so hard to pretend I didn't. And sitting there, in that small house that smelled of wet earth and sawdust, I made a decision. That night, I would open the chest again, not for answers, but for proof. The afternoon light came in low through the workshop windows, casting long streaks across the sawdust-covered floor. My boots crunched as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of oil and cedar wood settling deep in my chest. The chest was where I left it, sitting dead center on the bench like it belonged there all along. I didn't rush. I wiped down a stool with an old rag, sat slowly, and let my fingers trace the edge of the lid again. I had opened it once. This time, I planned to see what I'd missed. As I reached toward the inside corner, a faint buzz startled me. I froze, thinking maybe a bee had gotten stuck inside, but the sound didn't flutter. It pulsed. A vibration. I leaned closer, pressing my hand against the bottom. It was definitely coming from inside. I tapped gently. The sound shifted. That's when I noticed a hairline crack along the back panel. I grabbed a small screwdriver from the wall peg and gently pried at it. The wood creaked, then gave. Beneath the false bottom was a flip phone, thick with dust, battery corroded at the edges. Still, somehow it blinked to life the moment I touched it. One missed call. Date, 8 years ago. No name, just unknown. Before I could register what I was seeing, the phone lit up again. Incoming call. Unknown. I stared at it, half convinced I was dreaming. Then, without thinking, I hit answer. For a beat, nothing. Then a voice, soft, scratchy, deliberate. If you're hearing this, they've already changed everything. I knew that voice. My stepfather. It wasn't live. It was a recording. The call must have been cued somehow, triggered by motion or power. The message cut in and out, but I caught fragments. Never trusted Colton. High Rock Trust. Locked. Not in the will. By design. Lawyer changed the wording. Then static. Then silence. I lowered the phone, staring at it like it had just spoken from the grave. My pulse pounded in my ears. The man I thought left me with nothing was trying to leave me everything. I sat back on the stool, letting the silence settle again. The same workbench I was on. This was where he used to come when he couldn't stand the rest of the house. It was where he tinkered, sanded, fixed things just enough to call them useful again. The last time I saw him in this room, he was hunched over a wooden plaque. His hands shook, but he still managed to guide the sander across the surface. "You'll understand one day why silence matters," he said, without looking up. At the time, I thought it was just another vague piece of wisdom, one of those empty lines older men say when they've run out of patience. But maybe it wasn't empty. Maybe it was precise, intentional. Maybe he knew exactly what they were going to do. I pulled the rest of the contents from the hidden compartment, an envelope stuffed with receipts, a set of blueprints rolled tight and secured with a rubber band, and a small metal key with no tag. The receipts looked ordinary. Hardware store, lumber yard, a small print shop in town. The blueprints, architectural sketches of a storage unit or maybe a vault. The dimensions were labeled, but there was no location. Then, at the very bottom, one thin slip of paper with a logo I didn't recognize at first, High Rock Trust. And below that, barely visible, my name, Darius A. Winford. Not scratched out, not faded, printed. My fingers tightened around the paper. This wasn't just some last-minute stash. He'd planned this. Whatever High Rock was, my name was tied to it. And for 8 years, no one had said a word. The chest wasn't an insult. It wasn't a joke. It was a message. A trail. He didn't leave me out of the will because I meant nothing. He left me out because he knew the rest of them would twist it, fight over it, maybe even destroy what he really wanted me to have. Silence wasn't his way of keeping me small. It was his way of keeping me safe. The workshop had gone quiet again. No buzz, no movement, just dust floating in the sunbeam cutting across the room, landing on the chest's rim, soft and golden like ash from a long fire. I ran my hand across the chest one last time, as if thanking it for what it held. Proof. He may not have told me I mattered, not in words, but this told me in a language I finally understood. I folded the papers, pocketed the key, and slipped the phone into a tin box I locked in the drawer. There was more to uncover. I could feel it. But first, I had to find out what High Rock Trust meant, and why my name was buried in their files. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, I was already downtown, parked in front of a brick office building that hadn't changed much since the early 80s. I remembered it from when I was a kid. Back then, Eldon Graves had been the kind of man people whispered about. The kind of lawyer who didn't advertise because the right people already knew where to find him. The brass plaque on the frosted glass still said, Eldon Graves, Esker. I stepped inside. The place smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, though I knew he hadn't smoked in years. He sat behind a desk stacked with files and legal pads, dressed in his usual wrinkled shirt and vest, as if retirement had never really taken. He looked up, eyebrows rising just slightly. "Darius Winford, I thought I'd seen the last of your family." "Lucky you," I said, taking the chair across from him. I pulled out the slip of paper and laid it flat between us. "What do you know about High Rock Trust?" The lines around his eyes tightened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder marked Private Estate C. Winford. He opened it slowly, as if he already knew what I'd see. Inside was a series of documents, notarized forms, trust agreements, letters of instruction. "It was supposed to trigger after his death," Eldon said quietly, "but only if someone asked the right question." My name was there, on the second page, typed clean. Beneficiary, Darius A. Winford. He sighed. "Your stepfather didn't trust the others. He figured they'd swarm the will like flies to sugar. So he built this, separate, protected, outside of probate. A second trust." I leaned back. Why hide it? Eldon met my eyes. Because sometimes the quietest inheritance is the loudest revenge. He warned me not to move too quickly. Keep this between us, he said, at least until I verify nothing's been tampered with. The documents should have remained sealed, but something's off, I finished for him. He nodded. The High Rock file was reassigned 2 days before the funeral. Now it shows Colton Dreer as trustee. Colton. Of course it was Colton. Your name's still listed, but the control? That's what changed. I stood, jaw tight. So what does that mean, legally? It means someone moved fast. Illegally fast. If your stepfather didn't authorize it. I left Eldon's office with copies in hand and my boots heavier than when I'd come in. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. It was a theft. And the thief thought I wouldn't notice because I never made a fuss. They were right, until now. That evening, I got a text from Marilyn. Dinner tonight, just us. Let's clear the air. I almost ignored it, but something in the phrasing caught me. Just us never meant peace. It meant show. It meant staging. I showed up at Delacroix, a restaurant I'd only seen in glossy magazines, crystal glasses, waiters in white shirts and black ties, candles flickering at every table, too elegant for sincerity. My siblings were already seated when I walked in. Marilyn looked polished, distant. Jared grinned like nothing had ever happened. And Colton was in his element, glass in hand, spinning stories too smooth to stick. He raised his glass when I sat. To family, he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, and to the ones who keep it strong. Everyone chuckled, even the server. I looked at him, then slowly lifted my glass. He already was. Silence followed. It took a second for them to realize I wasn't talking about Colton. I was talking about the man they all thought they'd outsmarted. The one they buried too quickly. The one who didn't need to shout to be heard. Marilyn's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. Jared shifted in his seat. Colton kept his smile, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. No one spoke for a moment. I just leaned back and watched them try to recover. Try to pretend I was still the background figure they could control. For once, I didn't excuse myself early. I sipped my drink slowly, held their gazes when they tried to avoid mine. I asked questions they didn't want to answer. I let the silence stretch longer than it needed to. Colton excused himself twice to take a call. Jared made a joke about the valet scratching his car, but no one laughed. Marilyn picked at her food without touching it. By dessert, the tension had found its way into every fork and napkin fold. When I finally stood, I could feel their eyes tracking me. Marilyn followed me out. In the glow of the entryway lights, she grabbed my arm. Her voice was low, but sharp. You should stop digging. I didn't flinch. You should stop assuming I'm afraid to. She blinked, mouth parting, but no words came. I walked past her and let the door close behind me. Back in my truck, I looked at the folder again. The truth wasn't in what they gave me. It was in what they tried to keep. They'd written me off, forgotten me, left me with a box and a memory. And that was their mistake. The next morning, I found an envelope slid under my door. No return address, no name. Just 4 words written in thick black ink. Sign and freeze. The envelope sat in my lap, still sealed, still warm from the sun that crept through the blinds. It hadn't been there the night before, that much I was sure of. Whoever left it had done so quietly, deliberately. No knock, no footsteps, just 4 words written in bold black ink. Sign and freeze. I tore it open with steady hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, clean. The edges were sharp, like it had come straight from a printer tray. I opened it and felt the bottom drop out of my gut. It was a trust modification form, one I recognized. I'd seen a similar version in Eldon's office. This one bore my stepfather's name at the top, the familiar swoop of his signature at the bottom. But the middle line was what mattered. Beneficiary, Colton Dreer. The ink looked clean. Too clean. Something about it didn't feel right. I held it up to the light and squinted. The signature wasn't written, it was traced. I'd worked enough with woodworking templates to know what digital overlay looked like. Someone had copied his signature, pixel by pixel, and done it with expert precision. He didn't sign this, I muttered. Someone signed it for him. And if the date on the bottom was accurate, it was filed 3 days before he died. By noon, I was parking outside High Rock Trust's downtown branch. Their lobby was dressed up like a hotel. All marble floors, brass sconces, and fake smiles. A woman in her 20s sat behind a tall desk, typing so fast her nails sounded like rain on glass. Her nameplate said Harriet. I approached slow. "Hi, I'm just doing a little estate verification. I've got a question about an account under the name C. Winford." She glanced up. "Are you a trustee?" "No, just family." Trying to understand some of the documents we received. I showed her a blurred printout from Eldon's office, vague enough to invite questions, not answers. Harriet hesitated, then tapped at her keyboard. "Do you have the trust ID?" I gave her the number. She typed, paused. Her expression shifted. Her voice dropped. This file was reissued just days before Mr. Winford's passing. "Did he come in?" She shook her head. "There's no signed request from him on record, but there is an internal update." She spun the screen toward me just for a second. It read, "Requester, Colton Dreer." Harriet turned it back quickly, then hit a few keys. A document slid out from a back printer tray. She slipped it into a blank folder, shut it, and handed it to me like it was a receipt. "You didn't get this from me," she said, eyes darting toward the hallway. I nodded once. "You didn't give me anything." Back in my truck, I opened the folder. Same document, same forged signature. But now I had metadata, timestamps, routing records, digital breadcrumbs leading straight to Colton. The air in my lungs didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I'd crossed some internal threshold, from disbelief into calculation. This wasn't just manipulation, it was fraud, and not the sloppy kind. Colton knew the system. He knew the bank, the gaps in protocol, the clerks too young to question. I pulled out my phone and hit record. My voice stayed even. "You once told me silence is strength. Maybe this is what you meant, old man. Maybe you left me the kind of battle I was finally ready for." I slid the folder into the wooden chest back at home. The same chest they all thought was a joke. Inside it now lay the old phone with the voicemail and the forged document. 2 truths, waiting. Later that night, I cleared off the workbench in my garage. The light buzzed overhead as I pulled a blank legal form from the printer tray. Eldon had given me a draft to use in case we had enough to act. I crossed out the placeholder names and wrote mine, then Colton's, then the phrase Winford versus Dreer, petition for injunction, and asset freeze. The pen hovered over the signature line. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name in clean black ink, one stroke at a time. The moment the pen lifted, it felt final. No turning back, no more quiet dinners, no more pretending I didn't notice. I set the document beside the others, looked around my shop, saw the worn hammer hanging on its nail, the same one my stepfather used to fix the porch swing when I was a kid. He'd never said much, but now I understood. He'd been speaking all along, just in a language I hadn't learned until now. Let them deal with silence now, the kind that costs money, the kind that freezes everything. I whispered, not to anyone but myself, "Let's see how you like quiet when it comes with consequences." I placed the signed freeze order beside the old voicemail and closed the chest. For the first time in years, I felt still. Not calm exactly, but aligned, like a piece of lumber finally shaved smooth after years of splinters. I thought I'd bought myself some time. I was wrong. 3 days later, just before sunrise, my phone buzzed on the nightstand like it had caught fire. Calls, texts, emails, too many to read, and all from people I hadn't heard from in years. Neighbors, clients, even my barber. I rubbed my eyes and reached for the remote. The TV blinked on. Channel 5 News was already mid-story. Winford family scandal. Youngest son accused of forgery. There was my face. Driver's license photo. The one I'd always hated. Grainy, underexposed, cold. And there he was, Colton, polished, composed, standing in front of the press like a war hero with a paper cut. "It breaks my heart," he said, his voice lined with false grief. "But Darius always struggled with responsibility. We're trying to help him, not punish him." He even let his voice crack at the end. The man was practically crying on command. I turned off the screen before I threw the remote across the room. I stared at the blank screen and whispered, "So that's how you play." By midday, the effects were rolling in like a toxic tide. A furniture client I'd worked with for 5 years called to pause the project. Another text came from a supplier. "Until the legal stuff clears, we'll hold off on further shipments." Even the local cafe stopped carrying my handmade tabletops. I guess nothing ruins a latte like scandal. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was taking notes. Around 3, Marilyn called. Her voice was thin and cautious, like she didn't know which version of me would pick up. "He's gone too far this time," she said. I stared at the window, sunlight washing across my tools, casting long shadows. I replied, "He just saved me months of pretending." Silence. Then she whispered, "Be careful." Click. That night, I walked into my workshop and shut the door behind me. The smell of varnish and sawdust was still there, familiar, grounding. The tools hadn't turned their backs on me. The wood still took shape when I asked it to. I played the voicemail again. "If you're hearing this, they've already changed everything." Back then, I thought it was a warning. Now, I heard something different. "They'll only win if you fight on their terms." I set the phone down slowly, so I wouldn't. The next morning, I met Eldon at a dusty diner that hadn't updated its menu since the 80s. Vinyl booths, cheap coffee, perfect for quiet plans. He slid into the booth opposite me, briefcase in hand. "You've had a busy week." "You could say that." He pulled out a folder. "The federal review is underway. Colton's documents, the ones Harriet printed, they're already being flagged for forensic tracing. And the trust? Frozen. For now." I handed him the envelope Harriet gave me. "When it's time, release this. Publicly. Press, legal bar, state review board, I don't care. All of it." Eldon raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" I nodded. He burned my name. I'm just handing him a match. A smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "That'll end him." I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl in slow clouds. "No, that'll start something." Later that evening, I sat alone in the workshop. Outside, the sky was dark, holding back a storm that hadn't yet arrived. But I could feel it, like a current under my skin. The chest sat open. The documents inside weren't just evidence now. They were milestones. The phone, the papers, the audio. Each one a piece of the puzzle I'd once been excluded from. Funny thing was, they all assumed I'd explode. Go public, lose control. They forgot what quiet people do best. We watch, we wait, and when the moment's right, we move. I ran a hand across the grain of the chest's lid, the same grain my stepfather once stained with his bare hands. You thought I'd shout, I said softly, but you forgot what silence can do. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and growing. I didn't flinch. Let it come. I'd already reinforced my walls. The thunder didn't stop that night. It rolled into dawn, low and growling, as if the sky itself was clearing its throat. By the time I pulled my truck out of the driveway, rain had started falling in sheets, cold and fast. The kind of rain that doesn't ask permission. Downtown Austin was a blur of gray-red brake lights smeared across wet pavement. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, wipers working overtime. I'd been to court before, but never like this. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already formed a pack. Umbrellas bobbed above their heads like anxious jellyfish. Microphones, cameras, hungry eyes. I didn't wear a hoodie, didn't duck my head. I walked straight up the steps, papers tucked under my arm, soaked but steady. The moment I stepped inside, something shifted. I could feel it. All the years I'd swallowed words, all the shame I'd absorbed, they were crystallizing into steel. Inside the courtroom, Colton sat stiff in a tailored suit, jaw tight, lawyer whispering in his ear. Across the aisle, Eldon nodded once at me, then stood. He held up the digital records like they were gospel. This document, he said, was altered using a traced signature. The IP address confirms it was submitted from Mr. Dreer's home office 3 days before Mr. Winford's passing. There were gasps, phones raised to capture the moment. Colton's lawyer started spinning words. Accidental mistake, clerical confusion, but no one was listening. The lie had snapped under its own weight. It unraveled fast. The judge's questions weren't sharp. They were surgical. Mr. Dreer, can you confirm this signature was filed from your personal network? Colton's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. You think this proves anything? He spat. He was never meant to have that money. I stood slowly. Then why forge a signature? That silenced him. The judge leaned forward, expression unreadable. Mr. Dreer, you may answer. His voice cracked. Because he didn't deserve it. He never fought for anything. The air in the room changed. No more whispers. Just judgment. And not the legal kind. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed, slow and full, like the weight pressing on my ribs had finally broken apart. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped, but the storm inside had finally burst. A dozen reporters waited on the courthouse steps, mics outstretched like rifles. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't name names. I simply unfolded a single sheet of paper, the last letter my stepfather had written me. I read it aloud. What you build with patience lasts longer than what you steal in haste. I let the words hang. Then I looked up. I don't want their money. I want his name back. There was no applause, just stillness. Even the rain felt quieter for a beat. Then the questions started flying. I walked away. Colton came out moments later, flanked by 2 aides who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. His eyes darted from lens to lens, not with arrogance anymore, but fear. The kind of fear that crawls into your clothes and stays there. Marilyn didn't follow him out. She stayed inside. I waited under the awning for Eldon. He joined me, shaking his head. You could have destroyed him completely. I turned to him. I just had to stop him from destroying what was left of me. He nodded, understanding more than I said. We walked together down the courthouse steps, parting at the curb. I watched him go, then looked up. The storm clouds were beginning to clear, thin streaks of light slicing through the courthouse glass like quiet forgiveness. That night, back in the workshop, the chest sat where it always had. I sat across from it, the room still, lit only by the glow of a single hanging bulb. And then the phone buzzed, the old flip phone. I opened it slowly, heart thudding, not out of fear, but curiosity. It wasn't a call. It was a recording. One I hadn't played before. My stepfather's voice. Just laughter. Deep, tired, honest laughter. No words. Just that. For the first time, it didn't haunt me. It freed me. That night, I sat in the stillness of my cabin, the faint buzz of cicadas outside filling the quiet like a song I'd finally learned to hear. The storm had passed, not just the one in the sky, but the one I'd been carrying for years. The chest sat in the corner, no longer a threat. I had cleaned and repaired its warped wood a few days after the trial. Now its surface glowed warm under the soft lamplight, polished and proud, like something finally at peace with itself. I pulled the latch, slow and quiet, like I was waking something up. The hinges no longer creaked. The velvet lining had been brushed smooth. Nestled underneath the final layer was something I hadn't noticed before, a small brass key. It was warm in my hand, as if waiting for my touch. Beneath it, a folded slip of paper, 5 words, handwritten in my stepfather's sharp scrawl, "For when you stop surviving and start living." Tucked behind the note was an old property deed, my name on it, clear and legal, signed nearly 8 years ago by the man I'd spent most of my adult life trying to understand. The address led to a rural lot, a few hours west, near the edges of the hill country. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about what I could build, not with what he left behind, but with what he trusted me to create. The next morning, I packed a thermos of coffee, grabbed the key, and drove. The road twisted through cedar and mesquite, past fields gone golden in the late summer heat. I rolled the windows down, letting the breeze wash through. I didn't rush. This wasn't a race. Eventually, the road narrowed into gravel, then dirt. The mailbox was rusted, leaning, but the numbers matched the deed. At the top of a small rise stood a house, modest, single-story, long porch, stretching across its front like open arms. The paint was faded, the roof slightly bowed, but it stood firm. I walked to the door and slipped the key into the lock. It turned smooth, like it had never been forced. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but not neglect. It smelled of cedar, oil, and old tobacco, the scent of the man who raised me, or tried to. The walls were bare except for one photo nailed above the mantel, me and him, years ago. I was maybe 10, grinning wide, missing my 2 front teeth. He stood behind me with one hand on my shoulder, smiling like a man who'd built something that finally made sense. I stared at the photo, jaw tight. "You knew I'd come here," I murmured, "but only when I was ready." It was the kind of quiet that didn't accuse, it welcomed. In the back room, I found a large red toolbox, the heavy kind you only move when you mean to stay. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were blueprints. Not for a house, for a program. The Winford Restoration Fund. The sketches laid out plans for workshops, apprenticeships, partnerships with local trades, all aimed at helping skilled workers restore historic homes, especially those long forgotten by wealth and time. A folded letter sat between the pages. Legacy isn't what you keep, it's what you repair. That line stopped me cold. He hadn't left me a trust fund to spend. He left me a foundation to build on. I sat cross-legged on the floor, that old toolbox beside me, and laughed, not bitter, not hard, just soft and long, like air finally let out of a sealed room. That evening, I stayed at the house. No cell signal, no TV. Just the creak of the porch boards under my boots and the rustle of leaves whispering through the trees. I tied the brass key to a leather cord and looped it around my neck, not as jewelry. As a reminder, I stood under the open sky and looked up. The silence wrapped around me, not like a weight, but like a quilt. I pulled out the old flip phone, the one I had kept longer than I should have. I recorded one last message. Dad, I got your message. I'm done surviving. Then I powered it off, set it back into the chest, closed the lid gently, both hands firm on the wood. Just before it clicked shut, the old ringtone played, faint, soft, not eerie this time, like goodbye.